I know, it's gorgeous.
Yeah, no, this actually used to be my brother-in-law's bedroom, and after the boys moved out, became a library room. You know,
Wow.
maybe one day, right?
One day, one day. Yes, yes, yes. Well, we are now streaming, and our meeting is now on YouTube, and we want to welcome everybody to BLAW Live, and thank you for joining us on this Tuesday evening. We were talking about, for these last several weeks, justice, and we're talking about justice specifically as it relates to the church. And we're going to have a fabulous speaker with us tonight. And so as you're coming in, good evening, and pray that the day was fabulous for you today. And we're just going to take some time to just welcome everybody to BLAW Live. So it's good to be here. As you're coming on, please share. As you're coming on, let somebody know that we're here and that we are live and that they can be a part of the discussion tonight. And so thank you for being a part of it. Thank you for listening. And also, so please share. Also, just want to share with you, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel for Abundant Life Church. And anytime that we are on live on YouTube, you'll get a notification so that you won't miss what broadcasts and announcements and various services that we're doing at AOC. So thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you for sharing. And tonight we are so grateful to have Megan Leitz with us tonight. And as we talk about race, particularly in the church and in dealing with how do churches deal with this real issue of race. And so she's doing some fantastic work. And we're going to talk about that tonight. And I'd like to just share a little bit about Megan. And Megan was raised in Massachusetts in a place called Shutesbury, and never imagined that she would do work in the city, but she's been working in the area of racial reconciliation for quite a season now. And the Lord has blessed her in so many different ways to both live in the urban area and also been educated in the city of Boston. And she holds a master's degree from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary at CUNY, which you call the Center for Urban Ministry in Boston. And then she went on to get her Master of Sacred Theology from Boston University, where she studied the power dynamics of multiracial congregations. She's been on staff working at Abundant Life for approximately 5 years and came to Abundant Life working with my wife, Pastor Virginia Ward, being as an intern. And the Lord blessed us to have her serve in the area of our administrator for some time. And she's moved on to some work with the Emmanuel Gospel Center in Boston. And she's doing some great work in race relations among churches. And she's here tonight to talk to us about that. She's a mom, and her husband's name is Derek, and she has 2 beautiful children, Grace and David, and she is a wonderful asset to the body of Christ. And so we are so pleased to have Megan with us tonight. So Megan, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to be with you, and thank you, Bishop, for the opportunity to be here on BLAW Live.
Well, thank you for being here. I know that you are away for a little season, so thank you for taking the time to be with us via Zoom and via Facebook and via also on YouTube. So I know I just introduced you a little bit and just talked about your background a little bit, but tell us a little bit more of, what was the whole scenario of how you became so involved in the area of the work of the Urban Center and particularly with race relations?
Yeah. Well, as you right off my bio, never expected to be in an urban context, never expected to be involved in issues related to race. I was born and raised in a small rural town called Shutesbury, about 2 hours from here, from Boston, in Western Mass that has been home to my family for many generations. But and Shutesbury was predominantly white. So growing up as a kid, it was a very white world. I didn't have a lot of exposure to racial diversity. When I went to middle school and high school, I think that changed a little bit. I went to a regional school in the university town of Amherst, so you're exposed to more racial diversity. I remember when I was a kid, we would be required to go to the MLK Day assemblies and celebrations for Chinese Lunar New Year. We had the opportunity to take African American lit and go on cross-cultural service trips. And I even had a Black youth pastor that encouraged us to talk about issues related to culture and racism. And yet, in the absence of understanding our nation's history around racism, and in the absence of understanding how racial disparities exist today, and really in the absence of meaningful cross-racial relationships, all of that exposure, all that talk about multiculturalism and racial justice, it didn't mean much to me. As a matter of fact, if you had asked me back then, the first thing I'd think of when someone talked about racial justice was nothing having to do with faith or the Bible. It would be the people who'd be protesting, right, with their picket signs and their soapboxes. And that'd also be the same people who would get together, on Amherst Town Common and advocate for certain things that were also advocating for pro-choice and for same-sex marriage and for things that, when I was a kid, my parents taught me were against God's word. And so, to just see the people standing up for different things, it made me curious. It made me just not know what I thought about any of that. And I didn't think it was necessarily bad. I hadn't examined it. I wasn't particularly interested in it. It didn't connect to my lived experience. So I saw it as a liberal issue. I saw it as a political issue. I didn't see it connected to my faith. But that changed. And I graduated from high school. I went away to Gordon College, and my world got a little bit bigger. I remember getting to Gordon and it being a little bit of an adjustment. I hit campus and was super excited because I could walk from my dorm room across the quad to the bookstore. And that was the first time I had ever been able to walk to somewhere where I could purchase anything in my life, right? So baby steps. And the reason I got involved in urban ministry actually wasn't because I was looking to stretch myself much more, but it was because I was at a church fair, and in the midst of lots of unfamiliar things, I found a familiar face. I found the face of a pastor who was part of a kids camp that I was a part of when I was a kid. So I decided to go to his church, East Coast International Church in Lynn. And that church was really different from anything that I had experienced, being in an inner city environment, being more of a multiracial environment than I'd ever been a part of before. But I dove in, and God used that opportunity to really challenge some of the assumptions I had about what it meant, what life in the city was like, right? I got to know people. I got to hear their messy and complex and beautiful stories. And it was really through that I think God turned my heart towards the city. I felt that God was calling me in a really curious, like, can't believe this is happening, but all right, Lord, let's go with it, like calling me to urban ministry. And it was through that sense of call that I dove into Gordon's urban immersion program that sent me to Common Square in Dorchester and to Abundant Life Church, where I served as an intern. And it was that internship that was really transformative. An internship that, as you know, turned into a practicum and then turned into a job opportunity. And now 12 years later, Derek and the kids and I were all still a part of that community, but it was actually living in community with people of another race across cultural lines that helped me to see issues related to race and power and privilege and culture in ways that I never had before, right? Sometimes, because culture is like the air that we breathe, right? It's the water that we swim in. It's not until you're placed in something so very different that you're able to see actually what you carry and the culture and sort of parts of who you are. And so it was just doing life together, living in community, serving in ministry together that helped me to see how different my experience was as a white woman and really gave me a curiosity and a desire to learn more about issues related to race. And to see how that did apply to my faith, right? Because my faith was so important. And Bishop, you're always talking about how does faith and life connect, And as I was at Gordon Conwell, as I was at Boston University, I had the opportunity through my studies to develop a theology of racial justice and racial healing and racial reconciliation. And that really became my motivation for doing the work that I do now with the Race and Christian Community Initiative.
Wow. You definitely had a lot of experiences, and you traveled quite a range of spheres before you got to that point. But thanks for
Yeah.
sharing that. I'm going to dive right in and talk about what you're really doing. So first of all, many of us, and basically all of us, probably have seen over and over again the murder of George Floyd, and all of the things that have surrounded that since then, with protests around the world. Tell me about your feelings, and tell me about your perspective as you started to see that information and hear things that regarding the murder of George Floyd and all that's happening with that. So talk to us about what your feelings were and your perspective on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think my feelings were feelings of grief and mourning and lament and frustration and anger and just a, a deep sense of injustice. A deep sense of injustice. And, I often get the question, especially from my white brothers and sisters, why is this such a big deal? Like, yes, it's awful that someone died, and no one should die in that way. But what does this have to do with racial justice? Why is everyone talking about racism and pouring out into the streets? And I think part of the answer to that question, something that it's often hard for white folk to see, is that this wasn't an isolated incident. This is part of a much larger history, right? A history of lynching in the United States, a history of white people imbuing fear into people of color so they can exert control and dominance. It's part of a history of police and people in authority abusing their power, going from slavery to, vagrancy laws and convict leasing and Jim Crow mass incarceration right up to today. And it's part of just a whole larger system of racism and systemic racism in individuals and between people and in organizations and in social systems, right? And it doesn't, and and implicit biases and dominant cultures and power structures. And the officer who killed George Floyd and the officers who've been responsible for the deaths of countless other Black and brown people didn't need to know about any of that in order to be a part of that legacy and in order to have that impact. And so I think that is so important to remember, that what needs to be done, this isn't just a single incident, but it is larger systems and it's larger histories and philosophies and narratives and worldviews and perspectives that need to be disrupted. And protest and even riots are a way to make change. And protests is a powerful tool to changing policy, right? To making people listen when people have not been listening for so very long. Especially in the white community, you get a lot of pushbacks about the rioting, right? They say, why do you need to riot? Why do you need to be violent? And I think that with the riots, I mean, honestly, a lot of people who are rioting are opportunistic, right? Or are intentionally starting trouble because of their own agenda. But I agree with Martin Luther King when he said that rioting is the language of the unheard. And these riots have caught people's attention. There are a lot of people of color and others who've been speaking out for generations about injustice in America, and white people haven't listened. And so when we see the protests, when we see the riots, we also see a change that I think more now so than before, white people are listening. And, if that's what it took, now we're listening. We're listening more than I think we have been before. And I think that God can use that, and God can use the situation. The Lord can redeem all things. And it's my hope and my prayer that he will use this for lasting transformation.
Yeah, my hope is that it's not just a moment. It is really going to be a movement, and it's going to be something that is going to take us to the next level of really seeing justice prevail for everybody. And so, thank you very much. That's really great that you were able to share with us that insight from your experience. I also want to talk about, and I know that you're involved with the Race and Christian Community Initiative, which is a very strategic ministry that you planted and that you formed under the auspices of Emmanuel Gospel Center. Some of our viewers don't know what you actually do in that ministry, or know what that ministry actually does. I know that ALC, part of our missions, we support your ministry. So tell us about the ministry, and tell us why it's so important that you do this kind of work with the church, particularly the white evangelical church.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for asking. So the Race and Christian Community Initiative, it works to equip Christians in Greater Boston to engage issues related to race in ways that honor the image of God in everyone involved, and that work towards the righteousness and the justice that Jesus desires to see in our communities. We do that through a number of programs. The primary way that we work with the white evangelical community is through learning communities that we call cohorts. And we lead them on a 6-month-long journey where they learn about the theological foundation around issues related to race. Why should we respond to it as Christians? They learn about how racism manifests in themselves and in their society and in their congregations. And they learn how to respond to that, as an outworking of their faith. And then from there, we move them into support and accountability groups where they have the opportunity to discern action steps that they can take, and then both small groups and sort of large group structures that help them be faithful in living out their commitment to racial justice. We also offer workshops for people of all different races that address similar themes of sort of theological foundations, how racism manifests, how we can respond to it today, and community forums that help to address issues that are at the intersection of race and faith, and create community in spaces where people who are passionate about these things can come together and engage them with their brothers and sisters in Christ. So that's a little bit about what we do, but why is that important? And I think it's especially important now. Well, I don't need to tell you that America has a race problem, but what I often need to tell a number of my white evangelical brothers and sisters, and even my brothers and sisters who are not white, is that the church is called to address issues of racial justice. If we look at Ephesians 2:11-21, we can see that Christ not only died to reconcile us to God and to make our relationship right with him, but also to make our relationship right with one another. It says that because of what Christ did on the cross, he tore down the dividing wall of hostilities, right? Those walls of difference that prevent us from coming together and from being the church. But a lot of churches don't see this. They don't they see race as a social issue, right? As a political issue. They don't have a theological framework that looks at race and that looks at racism as frankly a sin, right? Racism is a sin. It oppresses people who are created in God's image. It poses an obstacle to the body of Christ working together effectively, and it diminishes the Christian witness. It is a lie. It is an idol. And yet so many churches, they know what to do with sin, but they don't know what to do with racism. But when we help people to take that theological perspective, right, of racism being one of the many sins that has permeated all of society and that needs to be addressed, right? Christ died on the cross to make things right, and as his body, we need to continue that work. Then that helps people to see issues related to race differently. It helps them to connect it to their life and to their faith, to their and to gain the spiritual tools that God has given us, right? The tools of prayer and fasting and scripture reading and lament and being together in Christian community in order to address racism. You know, it means that all of a sudden we have the tool and the journey of Christian discipleship, of that holistic transformation, right? That long-term journey that we can use as a ways to learn about and respond to issues related to race. And it also means that we can take that faith-based action, right? That Holy Spirit empowered action that we're bringing into so many areas of the world and actually using it in order to make change in areas related to race. So, you know, I think it's important because the church is called to respond to racial justice. And when we're not doing it, we're not fulfilling our call. We're not bringing in the tools and the resources that God has given the church to make a difference in the world. And the church needs to be stepping up, particularly the white church needs to be stepping up and living their faith out in areas related to race.
Oh, thank you. That's really interesting work. And I'm sure it's hard work to really kind of bring race to the forefront and talk about that openly. So where do you see the struggle when it comes to racism in the church? Where might be the real struggles and hurdles and difficulties that you find, particularly as you're working with churches who are predominantly white churches? Where's that struggle when it comes to issues of racism?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is harder for me to speak kind of to the church generally, right? Because of the population that I speak with. But I mean, I think the whole church, we need to learn how to listen. We need to learn how to hold different perspectives and tension, right? We need to learn how to bring our faith to bear on these issues. But the white evangelical church, I think, has some unique challenges. And one of the challenges is the white church needs to come to know and admit our racist history, right? How we have contributed to racism, how we're complicit in racism, and actually how we're still doing that today. I think the mental models of white evangelicals, they see racism as one person taking ill-intended action against another person because of the color of their skin. But as you know, right, racism is much bigger than that. It occurs in organizations and social systems. It manifests in multiple levels. But white evangelicals, you know, they say, "Oh, I'm a good person, so I couldn't possibly be racist," or, you know, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone, so I couldn't possibly be racist." And just wrestling with that mental model of I'm a good person, so therefore I'm a part of the problem. You know, I didn't mean harm, so therefore no harm actually happened, is really something that needs to be addressed within the church of white evangelicalism. Because people, you know, white churches, they'll jump in and they'll say, wow, racism is a problem, but they go in with the assumption that they have nothing to do with it. And as individuals, you know, people have different and are responsible for their own actions, and yet white evangelical congregations and communities are still very much a part of this and still having an impact that they might intend, that you need to be aware of, so you're not being counterproductive. I think another thing that white evangelicals really need to wrestle with is that their culture, you know, I'll say my culture, right? My culture and even my theology, right? That these things have very much been shaped by the history of racism, have been shaped by the fact that white evangelicalism has been a dominant expression of faith for hundreds of years, and white people have been the dominant racial group for hundreds of years, right? So we look at our culture and we see it as the culture, as normal, and even as normative. And yet, in doing so, we then ask people of color that come into our congregations or that we might collaborate with to conform to our culture, right? To our way of thinking and doing and being. And we don't see a problem with that. You know, we don't recognize that we're asking people to check part of themselves at the door, and sometimes some of the most best and beautiful parts of themselves at the door. And so I think that for white evangelicals, we need to see that what we just think is sort of normal and natural in the way things are and the way that things should be is one way of many. right? We need to examine ourselves and look at the ways that our culture excludes other people, that it prevents other people from expressing their authentic selves and using the gifts and the talents and the perspectives that God has given them. It limits our understanding of even who God is and how we're to engage with him and others. And it yeah, I mean, our whole theology is shaped by this and largely unexamined. And so I think we just need to recognize as white evangelicals how steeped we are in this and be willing to go back to examine these things and really to deconstruct our realities and what we thought we knew. And RCCI, we help white people do that. We come alongside them in a journey of saying, you know what, like, come on out of the matrix. This is going to be a wild ride, but what you have thought not only is not what your way of thinking and doing as being is not only not what you thought it was, but it's actually can hurt other people in ways you might not even realize. And that's a lot to wrap your mind around, but we lead white people through the journey of understanding that and then responding to that in a Christ-like way.
Well, that's great. As you were talking about the church, and I'm going to ask this question, and for those of you who are here with us tonight, we have Megan Leitz with us, and we're talking about race and the church. And if you do have a question, you can put it up in the chat box, and we're going to take questions from you, the audience and the viewers. And I wanted you to let us know, and let's see, as the Lord would lead us in this discussion. If you have any questions, please put them up in the chat box, and we're just going to continue our discussion on race in the church. And so while you're doing that, putting up your questions, I want to ask another question. When it comes to the church, and I had an online reunion with a number of my colleagues, and we had a conversation where I was one of 4 speakers and talking about, the issues of justice, and particularly racial justice. And one of the panelists, he said, the answer to racism, as it relates to the church, is to have more multicultural, multi-ethnic churches. That if we just have much more multicultural churches, it would be a solution where people would actually see that we're one. So I didn't really comment on it, but I would save this opportunity to ask you what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah. Well, I would say that multicultural churches can be beautiful things, but that's not necessarily the answer. People think that if you get people of different races in the room, isn't that wonderful, right? Like, we've arrived. But the fact of the matter is, sort of, mentioning what I was talking about before with the power and the impact of white evangelical culture, is just because people are in the room doesn't mean they have the same opportunities to shape and to influence the community. And when you look at white evangelical, when you look at, multiracial congregations, particularly congregations, my study and experiences in multiracial congregations that are predominantly Black and white, one would think that in that context, when you get people together, you would, you kind of get this happy medium between white and Black congregations, right? The best of both communities coming together in a wonderful expression before the Lord. But the fact of the matter is that if you have as little as 10% of white folk in a predominantly Black-led congregation, then in key indicators, the Black congregation will conform to the patterns and practice of the white folk. Right. So instead of sharing, you have that you still what we're seeing in the larger society is still being perpetuated in multiracial congregations. So I think multiracial congregations can be great. There's a lot of benefits of multiracial congregations. I mean, and this is well documented of how people are drawn in by racial diversity. They can if you're part of a multiracial congregation, you're more likely to have more racially diverse social networks. You're even you're more likely to be sharing social capital, right, among people of different races. And there's anyway a number of benefits I could talk about at length another time. But also, again, just because people in the room doesn't mean we've arrived. There can still be much more work that we need to do. I also recognize the need for churches that are spaces for people of color and spaces for white people. I would never say that a segregated church is necessarily in sin or a part of God's plan. Like, I recognize why different churches need to worship in that space, be able to celebrate their culture, express themselves according to their culture. So I say that there's a need for both. And when you do have multi-racial congregations, you really need to come at it with an eye at what are the power dynamics and how is this community being experienced by all of the members of the community.
Oh, yeah, because we talk about that a lot in terms of when it comes to attracting people where we are an African American, predominantly African in our ethnicity. So we have people from Haiti, people from Jamaica, Barbados, different parts of the Caribbean, and in the South. And so as we're in a city, we're located in a city that's predominantly white. It's just poses a very interesting thing of how we as a congregation will interact with our city, will interact with those who are living around our church, and the dynamics will always possibly be changing, as people of different ethnicities will come in, different races will come in. So when you came to Abundant Life, okay, what makes Abundant Life comfortable for you, being in a predominantly a Black church?
Well, I will say when I first came, the first time that I ever came to Abundant Life, I didn't feel uncomfortable. I didn't feel intimidated. And I think that was due to a number of factors. And honestly, part of it is just because of my own whiteness. Because as a white person, I'm not used to there being places that I'm not allowed to go. I'm not used to going places where I don't feel welcome. There's almost a sense of entitlement among white people, right? Like, I can go there, and now when I look at places where people of color are gathering, like, I see them as holy and sacred places, right? Where people are just expressing themselves and honoring their culture, and like that's a sacred space. And it's really, I'm grateful that Abundant Life welcomes people of all different races. But I think another reason I felt welcome was because people welcomed me really warmly. I remember coming in January. It was during our fast, and myself and my roommate showed up. She had coffee in her hand when like everyone couldn't drink coffee, and they were all like, "Oh man, coffee!" And we go up to coffee hour, and everybody wants my roommate's coffee. And Reverend David, who was there at the time, just welcomed me over to the table as I'm kind of awkwardly like looking around, trying to find a place. And we started talking and built a relationship that still exists today. And I think it was just getting to know people, building those personal relationships, being welcomed into community that really made a difference. And also, authentic relationships. So people being honest and, just being like, hey, that thing that you did right there, like, don't do that. Like, that's, like, you just offended somebody, or like, you're really green and this is why, or let me explain to you how this works. Or, I remember one of the sisters in the church surprised me and was like, listen, I'm just going to be straight with you. You can't wear what you're wearing right now. I'm going to bring you shopping and help you out, So just people being real and choosing to invest in me really made all the difference.
Wow. That's incredible. I never knew the experience. I never asked you what your experience was like when you first came to Abundant Life. So I'm glad to hear it. question that's in the chat box is, what would you say white evangelicals who are contemplating joining a multi-ethnic or ethnic specific church? What would you say to those white evangelicals who are contemplating that?
Uh, well, I will say that being in a multi-ethnic church, particularly a church where racially I was a numerical minority, and I would put myself under the leadership of people of color, that was an incredibly transformative experience for me personally. So I will say, that can be very fruitful, but as you're going into that, I mean, my situation is unique, right? Because I came as an intern, I came with an invitation. And I think that also helped me to enter in with confidence, right? Like a reason to feeling like I belonged there, and that I was welcome there, right? Um, Now I would, yeah, I mean, I would even like before joining another Black church, I'd make sure that that was okay, right? That I was welcome in that space. But I think one of the things I would say is that the ways that I learned most about the church, and I think had the most transformative experience, was because one, well, actually, let me back up. I will say first, go in with openness and humility. Don't assume that the way you're used to doing things is the right way. Because the more I got to know Abundant Life and Abundant Life's culture, things that were very different, or I didn't understand, or I felt were inefficient, or just, it didn't make sense to me, I found that there's reasons behind these things. And just because I didn't know them didn't mean that they weren't sort of reasons that make everything function and operate. I would also say, go in again, listen and learn. I've had too many white evangelical people tell me about situations where after, hearing a sermon from a Black pastor, they wanted to go up and say, well, like that wasn't quite that exegetical 3-point sermon, like as someone who's trained at Gordon Conwell, let me tell you, right? Like I took that one preaching class. Let me tell you how to stick closer to God's word, right? Without understanding the Black preaching tradition. Don't do that. So just come openly, listen, learn, but also serve. It was through serving that I mean, and I was there as an intern, right? Like that's what my job was, but I didn't realize how helpful that was in helping me to get to know people, to develop relationships, even to be able to develop trust, because people that knew that I was there to help the best way I could. And the final thing I'll say is that, as you're going there, submit to leadership of color, even if you don't understand what they're doing or why they're doing it. I mean, yes, and you can ask respectful questions. You can take the time to learn, and try to learn in ways that don't put the burden on, the leadership of color, right? But submit to leadership of color and just be there to serve and allow and pray that the Lord would use this as a transformative experience. And yeah, I think that's what I'd recommend.
Wow, thank you. That's very informative. I remember when we would travel as a group, as a church, and we went to different places. Went to Africa, uh, went to Haiti, went to different mission trips. You came on the trip to Africa, but also we went
Yeah.
to many conferences together. I remember we went to Gordon Conwell, and we went to the Luzon conference, and
Yes.
we had a very interesting conversation at our table of, with a gentleman who came to the table, and we talked about our church, and I guess he couldn't quite grab the idea that I was your pastor and so-called your boss. Tell us what that was like for you. You had to talk to him about that.
Yeah, well, I remember it being that happening on more than one occasion, where we would go places together and people would assume that we weren't together. And people actually, I mean, even be worse than someone not being able to grasp that you were my pastor and that you're my boss. But before even like knowing anything about us on the Gordon Conwell campus, white people would walk up to me and try to shake my hand before they shook your hand, right? Like I was in my 20s, like a young white woman in my 20s. I probably looked like a Gordon Conwell student, and here you are, Pastor, Larry Ward, I mean, now Bishop Larry Ward. And it's just, but people are used to, they see what they expect to see. And I think that even ties into this recent racial violence, right? That we've been socialized by media to see Black people, especially Black men, a certain way, right? So it's really hard for white people to look at a Black person and to, I think, actually even perceive them accurately, right? In the case of police and police violence, I think white officers often see Black people as more of a threat than they actually are, you know? And when it comes to you being on Gordon Conwell's campus, the expectation is not that you're bishop. Their expectation is informed by all these things that people see in the media. And so it's important to have those conversations where you can help people see the positive examples of Black people that challenge their implicit biases. And the good news is that when people do have those biases challenged, it can actually help change the way that people see people.
Wow, that's insightful. That's very insightful. Thank you. Question in the chat box. We have some great comments about Wilson was saying that she felt very welcome when she came to ALC, and all the saints that really began to share with her the truth. So you can see that in the chat box. There's a question is, what do you think are some of the next steps for the Evangelical Church, especially during an election year?
Oh, wow. Great question. So I think there's a lot of practical things the white evangelical church can do. And I mean, the first thing I would say is white evangelicals stay engaged. Don't turn away. Don't change the channel. Don't go back to business as usual, because we're so, like, we have that option, you know? And I think that white evangelicals thinking about these issues are uncomfortable, especially thinking that they are complicit in this, that they're a part of the problem. But they need to learn how to persevere through that discomfort and then figure out what they can do in order to take practical steps towards change. And I think that this means, I mean, for a lot of people, for a lot of white evangelicals, the first step is just learning, right? Pick up a book, listen to a podcast, watch a documentary or a movie. There's so many things out there. You don't need to like talk to that one Black person in the office about racism in order to figure this out. Like, there's so many resources, and I'm happy to direct people to some of those resources as well. But take time to learn. And then as you're learning, disrupt racism when you see that happening, you know, name racism when when you see it going on. And that can be everything from like interrupting a racist joke or explaining why Black Lives Matter, to, for churches, hosting a Bible study on biblical justice, right? Naming issues from the pulpit. And as Christians, there's also, as white evangelical individuals, I mean, we're thinking about elections and election year and resources. First, especially during COVID-19, right, where there's so many racial inequities that are like front and center, support organizations that are meeting the needs of people of color, support organizations that are led by people of color, send your money there, volunteer there. And then also with the economy reopening, support businesses of color. RCCI is actually going to be sending out tomorrow a newsletter about how businesses of color have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. We actually have a whole COVID-19 page that I can talk a little more about later, that talks about those racial disparities and practical steps that people can take to make a difference, organizations that people can support in order to make a difference, and businesses of color that people can give their business to in order to make a difference. And then that political question, right? Advocacy and voting. Do it. Go out and vote. Learn, advocate for policies. You can go on websites, and I actually have a link to this also on the COVID page. The NAACP and other organizations, they have all these lists of policies that they're advocating for is in the best interest of people of color. So even if you're like, I don't know what a person of color would want, like, there are organizations that are advocating for these things and explaining why it's in the best interest. And so I think even if it doesn't seem like it's in your best interest, go out and vote and advocate for these policies that will work towards racial change. Also, as people are talking about politics, like, don't be afraid to be a part of that conversation in the way that disrupts racism, explaining, why, I mean, and since we're talking about politics, right? Like, and I'm here in the Midwest with my family, so we're often having conversations, right, about why is President Trump racist, and why are these policies not working towards equity and inclusion, but actually working against them? So being willing to have those conversations in our social circles, and then advocate and vote and give accordingly.
Thank you. That's very good. We want to definitely talk about the resources and really find out ways and means by which we can understand more about getting involved in dealing with racial injustice. And we want to just make sure that we are engaged as a church. Um, a question, I have for you as well is there's churches now that are looking and more open to thinking about partnerships and
Mhm.
partnerships with urban churches. Um, on one hand, I understand that yes, there's a desire for a suburban church, mostly probably white, in its constituency and all of its in its congregants, reaching out into the urban center with either black and brown churches. Um, but I also want to find out from your perspective, um, what what things should you caution us or make us aware of when it comes to forming partnerships with black and brown congregations and white congregations? What would you say?
Yeah, so I would say that many beautiful things can come from cross racial and also urban suburban partnerships, um, mutual benefit, mutual learning. And yet, there's also a lot of potential for pain and for counterproductive consequences. And this is just the nature of reaching across racial lines. And so, I think of a well-known cross-racial partnership between People's Baptist Church and North River Community Church in Pembroke. And this was a church between, or sort of a relationship where the white church, North River, had an understanding that whenever there was a disagreement, obviously they try to talk about it and work it out. But if they couldn't, if there was sort of a stalemate, right, a fundamental misunderstanding, that the white church would follow the leadership of the black church. And I think that that's would be an important piece of advice today, right? That the suburban church, if they're serving in an urban context, that they would trust that the church in the city knows better the needs of the urban community than they do as someone who came from outside of the urban community. So just being aware of those power dynamics and talking about them up front, I think that Pastor Atwater had enough awareness of power dynamics that he was able to put that rule in place. Or I don't know that that came directly from him, but he was able to support that as the pastor. um so yeah, just be talking, because the issue, and you see this not only in cross-racial relationships but also in just suburban urban relationships. There's a lot of um uh what's the word, like paternalism, and a lot of we're here to help you, and we have all the resources, and those attitudes need to be checked at the door. But too often they're not, right? So a lot of it starts with why are you choosing to engage? And I think, and is this, say, white suburban church, even if they are well resourced and can do lots of things in order to quote unquote help, right? How helpful are they going to be actually? And what foundation is going to be laid in building relationships and in building understanding and in navigating conflict ahead of time, so that both parties can know that they'll be honored and that things will be able to move forward despite the inevitable bumps along the way.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Because questions are coming up now, and we're talking with different pastors. And they're asking about partnership. They're asking about what they can do in the urban center, and certainly, my thinking is, I want to do something that's going to have impact for the kingdom, of course, and do something that's much greater than we could do on our own. But we certainly don't want to be in a position where, because we're black and brown, or black and brown church, that we're just kind of just working out, what it really means to kind of figure something out that's not really impactful to anybody's life or anything. we need some partnerships that's going to really make some impact. So thank you very much for telling me a lot of your perspective on that. Question that we have here comes from Maurice. He says, have you seen a shift in the time with your organization? Have you seen any shifts with your organization? How are you measuring, outcomes? Is it getting better? Is transformation happening? What's going on?
So within my organization and the work that I do particularly, or sort of within the broader white evangelical church?
Within the work that you're doing actually at EGC.
Yeah, so RCCI, actually part of the work that we do actually does face inward. So we help, we're part of RCCI. I am a member of a larger racial justice team at EGC that helps to do everything from, like, we have one-on-one conversations and do evaluations to help better understand the racial climate at our organization. We have facilitated conversations and workshops on issues related to race. We have worked in order to build measurement tools and and reporting around racial and gender equity. So there is, and things as simple as just creating opportunities for fellowship and relationship development and getting to know one another. At one time we had an outside group come in and talk to us about issues related to race. And one of the things that came up is actually one of the greatest things that we could do in order to overcome some of the racial tension in the organization was just get to know one another more, right? So we're also creating those opportunities for fellowship and for open communication. So those are some changes or some work that we've done over the years. But outside of our organization itself, I should explain the Emmanuel Gospel Center it's an umbrella organization. So there's lots of programs within that. And my program is one of many. And that is the work that we've done among the staff at the Gospel Center and the other program directors. But then outside of this, we've done work. We always evaluate the programs that we do. And I think one of the greatest testimonies to RCCI's work is a group of 8 people that on 4 years ago responded to a blog post that I wrote challenging white evangelicals to engage in issues related to race. And they showed up on a snowy April 1st morning to have a conversation on issues related to race. There was more than 8 at that first meeting, but 8 from that meeting have actually been walking with me on a journey, participating in a year-long cohort experience, learning community, helping me to develop that for others, and help me also develop sort of the next step to that learning community, which is a support and accountability community where white evangelicals can take action to contribute to dismantling of racism. And so all this time later, this community is still together. We're still learning. They're really investing in what's going on with RCCI. And I'm seeing members of this community, along with others who've joined them along the way, hosting conversations on race in their congregation. So, they'll bring me into their church and we'll work together in order to have a larger conversation among, in this case, it was a young adult ministry, or seeing people volunteering in their workplaces, diversity and inclusion office, or another woman is working to help transform rural economies that are heavily invested in the prison industrial complex, and helping them invest in things other than that, so they're not perpetuating mass incarceration. So some people are doing this professionally. Some people are just focusing on having conversations with their families, or being intentional about crossing racial lines in their daily experience so they can develop different relationships and try to better understand the community that they're a part of, and be able to advocate for their community in a way that reflects the desire of their community instead of sort of their own socialization as a white person. So those are just a few examples of what people are doing through our support and accountability groups. But we've seen sort of that transformation from people showing up at the group saying, I don't really know much, but I know that racism is a problem and Jesus is a part of the solution. And I want to journey on with you. And they've, taken many steps and brought others with them to now live their faith out in the area of race relations among their sphere of influence.
Wow, it's tremendous work, and I've seen and heard testimonies, and I've been to the many different times of gathering, especially when coming into times of where fundraising and working to really expand on that ministry, and it's a tremendous thing that pastors are experiencing about how their congregations are really finding it a wonderful experience to really opening their eyes to issues of race. And so you're doing a fantastic work with that.
Well, thank you.
I go one more question, and then we're going to get to resources. And
Yeah.
before because we have about let's see, we have about 8 minutes left, and we want to make sure that we end on time. And so, question is, what are you seeing and hearing from the next generation of youth regarding race and the church? Are you hearing anything?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that we need to talk about it. We need to talk about race and racism in the church. You know, and I'll speak as my experience as a millennial, but millennials are, you know, racial justice is something that is very and justice generally, I think, is something that is really important to them. And so to not address this, it feels like the church isn't speaking into an issue that we're seeing, a very real felt need among our generation. Now, obviously, I'm speaking really generally, but I'd say, you know, if I go somewhere and they're not talking about issues related to justice, they're not talking about like the felt needs and the experiences that people are experiencing on the ground, then like what are we talking about? You know, like some like sweet by and by and all this like spiritual things that are wonderful and can be really helpful, but you've got to connect it to life. And that's one of the things that I appreciated about Abundant Life's ministry, and why I think that churches need to be talking about this, because the younger generation cares. The programming that we have at RCCI is intergenerational. Our cohorts are intergenerational. Our workshops are intergenerational. I think that's one of a strength, because we can really learn from one another. And yet at the same time, a lot of interest comes from people who are in their teens and 20s and 30s, right? And if the church isn't talking about it, you're missing out on an opportunity to equip the younger generation in order to follow Christ into the future.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it's also important to understand that when being a baby boomer at kind of like the end of the baby boom generation, um, talking about race can be a very difficult thing for baby boomers, especially if you've been through the period where, you know, I was actually a small young man, boy, when Martin Luther King was killed. So it's when you see racism of that magnitude, your community is burning, redlining, and all the other things that are, you know, against Black men, particularly Black men. And pastors are very emotional talking about that. And even in seminary, we're not necessarily educated to talk about racial justice either. We deal with biblical justice, but sometimes you're not necessarily clear about the racial justice and how to approach that. And you may not want to come off as an angry African American male when you're talking about racism because of the passion that's involved in that. So sometimes it can be a little difficult to talk about racism and talk about certain parts of the history of that along the way. I think the AME Church has done a fantastic job of educating. And I think we need to do as a church more in the way of educating our young people around the history of racism and also biblical justice and what that really means. So thank you very much. And one more question, then we're going to get to resources, okay? Talking about white evangelicals, says I have been contacted by many in my community because they know that we are family of faith in all. However, I find myself having trust issues, like they are reaching out of sincerity, or do they just mean to be part of their story? How can you tell when they're really genuine or being political?
Wow, it's a great question. And I think, you know, it's people's motivations matter. And yes, I mean, it's understandable that the asker of this question would have trouble trusting, you know, white people who are reaching out to them. And I think that's very reasonable. And that's actually, you know, a good gut check, right? You know, is this a relationship that we should invest ourselves in when cross-racial relationships take a lot of time and a lot of energy? But I think, how do you know if someone is authentic? I will say what people have said to me when I've been concerned about initiating cross-racial relationships, and that's, you know, like that people will know that you're authentic, right? People will know that you care, and so you just go and you be yourself as a white person, right? And you know, can you see that authenticity? Can you see that genuineness in someone? But just because someone's genuine, like when I first came to Abundant Life, I was really genuine. I mean, I was just an intern, like I was fulfilling college credit, right? You know, but I was there to serve, right? Like I was called to ministry, there to serve. But that didn't mean that I understood racism or the ways I contributed to it or the ways that I could hurt other people, and, you know, or how power dynamics operated, right? So someone can have really good intent and they can still have a negative impact. I think you just need to discern, where is their heart at? Where's their spirit at? When I first interviewed for being an intern in Abundant Life, one of the things that Rev said to me, we had like a phone conversation that couldn't have lasted more than a couple minutes, but at the end of it, Rev said, you know, Megan, I like your spirit. You got the internship. But there was something that she could sense there, right? And she invited me into the community. And again, that didn't mean I had it all together. I certainly made my mistakes along the way. But she knew that God was working in me and that the Lord had led me to this place. And so I would ask, you know, people to discern, do you see God's leading in this relationship? Even when you can't know the white person's motivations or intentions or where they're at or how much they might hurt or frustrate you, is the Lord guiding this relationship? And if the Lord is guiding the relationship, then I believe, you know, even if the road is a little bumpy, that God can use that for his honor and glory.
Well, thank you. So in the remaining moments, can you give us some resources, kind of just shooting rapid fire to give us some resources? Thank you very much, Megan.
Yeah. So, you know, one thing, let me direct you to our CCIs. We actually have a website and a resource page, and there's a number of resources there. One that I'll bring to your attention is, and I'm going to send out the email links and the information on how to find it. So, you know, check the BLAW Live website and you can find that information. But one is, we have just like a little handout on the theological foundation for issues, for why Christians should engage issues related to race. We also have, especially for some of the white evangelical brothers and sisters, we have a number of resources ranging from starter resources for white evangelicals who want to learn more about issues related to race. We have books and articles and a number of blog posts that, you know, help like 5 mind-blowing realities about race that white people may not know, right? Or a blog post called Not That Kind of Racism, how good people can contribute to racism even without awareness of intent. So different things, if churches are coming to you, right? If people are saying, hey, can we be in a relationship? Saying, hey, check out these resources. Let me know what you think about them, right? As a conversation starter, checking what people's knowledge is. And you can get a sense in talking to the person, like where they're at, right? That's an important way to evaluate whether the relationship is one that is safer and worth investing in. I would also turn people, especially in this current moment with COVID-19, if you go to the homepage of our webpage, the homepage for our CCI, www.egc.org/race, there are 2 big buttons that say confront racism during COVID-19. And that will let you know practical things that you and others can do during this really critical time in our nation's history, in the life of our city, where we're rebuilding, and we want to make sure that we're rebuilding in a way where there is more equity and justice than there was before. If you want to learn, yeah, I mean, I have like pages upon pages of resources, and asking for general resources is a pretty general ask. But if you are looking for a particular resource, please email me at mlietz, that's MLIETZ @egc.org, and I'm happy to make customized recommendations.
Great, thank you. We'll also post that the resources and the links on the website, the AOC website, aoccambridge.org, and making sure that people are have access to those great resources that you just suggested. So we're going to end now. It's time that we go. Time flies when you're having some wonderful discussions like this. So Megan, I really want to thank you for taking the time. I know you're at your way with your family and taking the time to be with me and our congregation tonight on BLAW Live. And you're talking about this very important issue of racial justice in the church. And thank you so much for being a part of that. So everyone, just give a shout out of love to Megan, and thank you all so much for being a part of BLAW Live tonight. Wish you well and praying for your safety. Just want to remind you that this is now still, we are in COVID season, right? We still have to protect ourselves. It's going to be a very busy weekend. And you want to get out, of course, but make sure that you are protecting yourself, make sure that you're social distancing, washing your hands, and maintaining all those things that we need to do to stay safe. All right. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Tonya, for really helping us out every week. And we love everyone every one of you. And so thank you so much for being a part of BLAW Live. Have a good night, everyone. May God bless you. May the Lord cause his face to shine upon you and give you his peace. In Jesus' name, amen. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bishop.
We're going to hang a little bit, Megan. We're going to hang a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
All right. I think it's us that are left.
I'm here.
I see you. So what'd you think, Megan? You okay? See, easy as pie, right?
Yeah, just having a conversation.
Yeah.
Hold on. Why can't I see you? Oh, there I am.
Why can't you see me? I can't see you.
Now you should see me.
There
Oh
you
my
are.
gosh, did you see that wicked brain cramp I had at the end? All of a sudden.
Your brain cramp, what's the matter with you?
No, all of a sudden, Sister Sonia's video popped up, and then trying to get her out of it, I made her full screen. Everybody else went away. I'm like, no.
All right.